The first light of dawn crept over Harmony Creek, casting a soft glow on the quiet neighborhood. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, their songs a stark contrast to the grim scene about to unfold. It was a morning like any other, until it wasn't. Mrs. Margaret Tillman, a retired schoolteacher and Eleanor Vance's next-door neighbor, was out for her daily walk. She liked to start her day early, enjoying the stillness before the world woke up. But today something felt off. As she passed Eleanor's house, she noticed the back gate slightly ajar. Odd, she thought. Eleanor was meticulous about keeping it closed. Curiosity got the better of her. She pushed the gate open and stepped into the backyard. The garden, usually a vibrant display of flowers and greenery, looked disturbed. The soil was upturned in places, and a few plants were crushed, as if someone or something had stumbled through in a hurry. Then she saw it. Eleanor Vance lay on the ground near the rose bushes, her body unnaturally still. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. Then instinct took over. She fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. There's a body, she stammered into the phone. In Eleanor's backyard. I think it's her. The first responders arrived within minutes, their sirens slicing through the morning calm. By then, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion. Neighbors whispered to each other, their faces pale with shock. Detective Marcus Hale was among the first to step into the backyard. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Behind him, Officer Lisa Torres followed, her expression grim. The scene was jarring. Eleanor Vance's body lay sprawled on the grass, her clothes torn and disheveled. Her face, once warm and kind, was now frozen in an expression of pain and fear. The ground around her was disturbed, the grass flattened in a chaotic pattern that suggested a struggle. Hale crouched beside the body, his gloved hands carefully examining the area. He noted the bruises on Eleanor's arms, the deep scratches on her neck, and the way her head was turned at an unnatural angle. This wasn't just a murder. It was an act of violence fueled by rage. This was personal, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Torres nodded, her eyes scanning the perimeter. No sign of forced entry, she observed. Whoever did this knew her, knew the house. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Every seat was filled, and the low murmur of voices created a constant hum that grated on Clara Vance's nerves. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Beside her, her attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Harper, shuffled through a stack of documents, her expression focused. Across the room, Richard Holt sat with his lawyer, a smug-looking man in an expensive suit. Richard's face was calm, almost serene, but Clara knew better. She had seen that look before, the mask he wore to hide the storm brewing beneath. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, entered the room, and everyone rose. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying authority. She glanced at the two parties before her. "We're here to resolve the matter of custody for the minor children, Emily and Jacob Holt. Both parents have presented their cases. I've reviewed the evidence, and I'm ready to deliver my ruling." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and hoping for months. The custody battle had been brutal, a months-long ordeal that had drained Clara emotionally and financially. Richard, a pastor with a loyal congregation and a carefully crafted image, had fought tooth and nail to gain full custody of their children. He had painted Clara as an unfit mother, accusing her of being unstable and unreliable. But Clara had fought back. With the help of her attorney, she had presented evidence of Richard's abusive behavior, recordings of his explosive temper, testimonies from friends and family, and even a police report from the night he had shoved her during an argument. Her strongest ally had been her mother, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had been by Clara's side every step of the way, offering unwavering support and testifying on her behalf. "Your Honor," Linda Harper had said during her closing argument. This isn't just about custody. It's about protecting two innocent children from a man who has shown time and time again that he cannot control his anger. My client has provided ample evidence of Mr. Holt's abusive behavior, and we urge the court to grant her full custody. Richard's attorney had countered with his usual charm, painting Clara as a vindictive ex-wife trying to ruin Richard's reputation. But Clara could see the cracks in his argument. The judge's expression had been unreadable, but Clara had held on to hope. Now, as the judge prepared to deliver her ruling, Clara felt a surge of anxiety. She glanced over at Richard, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. In the matter of custody for Emily and Jacob Holt, the judge began, her voice steady. I have considered the evidence presented by both parties. While Mr. Holt has expressed a desire to maintain a relationship with his children, the court cannot ignore the documented instances of abusive behavior. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Was this it? Was she finally going to win? Therefore, the judge continued, I am granting full custody to Ms. Clara Vance, with supervised visitation for Mr. Holt. The words hit Clara like a wave, relief and disbelief washing over her. She turned to Linda, who gave her a small, satisfied smile. Across the room, Richard's face darkened, his calm mask slipping for just a moment. But the moment was fleeting. By the time the judge adjourned the court, Richard had composed himself, his expression unreadable once again. Outside the courtroom, Clara hugged her mother tightly. We did it, Mom, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. We actually did it. Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. You were brave, Clara. You stood up to him and you won. Your children are safe now. But as they celebrated, Richard emerged from the courtroom, his lawyer trailing behind him. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking onto Clara's. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and cold. You think you've won, but you've just made a huge mistake. Clara's stomach churned, but she held her ground. Stay away from us, Richard. The court's made its decision. Richard's gaze shifted to Eleanor, and for a moment, Clara saw something in his eyes, something dark and dangerous. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Eleanor watched him go, her expression troubled. Clara, she said quietly, be careful. He's not going to let this go. Clara nodded, but she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Richard's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that the battle might be over, but the war was far from won. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive. Richard sat alone in the dimly lit living room, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The amber liquid caught the faint light from the lamp, but it did nothing to warm the cold fury settling in his chest. He replayed the day's events in his mind, over and over, like a broken record. The judge's words echoed in his head. Asterisk full custody to Ms. Clara Vance, with supervised visitation for Mr. Holt. Asterisk supervised visitation. As if he were some kind of criminal. As if he were a danger to his own children. His grip tightened around the glass, his knuckles turning white. Clara had done this. She had taken everything from him, his family, his reputation, his future. But it wasn't just Clara. It was Eleanor. Eleanor Vance. The name alone made his blood boil. She had been the one to plant the seeds of doubt in Clara's mind, the one to encourage her to leave him. She had stood in that courtroom, her voice steady, her eyes filled with disdain as she testified against him. He's not the man he pretends to be, she had said. He's controlling, manipulative, and dangerous. Dangerous. The word burned in his mind. How dare she? How dare she paint him as some kind of monster? She didn't know him. She didn't understand the sacrifices he had made, the pressure he had endured. Richard stood abruptly, the sudden movement causing the whiskey to slosh over the rim of the glass. He set it down on the table with a sharp clink, his mind racing. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let them take everything from him. Clara had the children, but Eleanor was the one who had made this possible. She was the one who had to pay. Richard began to pace, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. His thoughts grew darker, more focused. He imagined confronting Eleanor, making her see what she had done. He imagined her fear, her regret. But it wasn't enough to just confront her. She needed to understand the pain she had caused him. She needed to feel it. He stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as a plan began to take shape. It wasn't fully formed yet, but the seeds were there, taking root in the fertile soil of his anger. He walked to the window, staring out into the night. The street was quiet, the houses dark. Everyone was asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. "You think you've won," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "But you have no idea what I'm capable of." He turned away from the window, his mind made up. He wouldn't wait for the courts, for appeals, for some miracle that would never come. He would take matters into his own hands. Eleanor had taken everything from him. Now he would make sure she paid for it. The days that followed the custody ruling were a blur for Richard. He barely slept, his mind consumed by thoughts of revenge. He stopped going to church, stopped answering calls from his congregation. The once polished image of the devoted pastor began to crumble, but Richard didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was making Eleanor pay. He spent hours sitting in his car outside her house, watching her come and go. She lived alone, her routine predictable. Mornings were spent tending to her garden, afternoons running errands, evenings sitting on the porch with a book. She looked so peaceful, so content, and it infuriated him. How could she live like nothing had happened? How could she act as if she hadn't destroyed his life? One evening, as he watched her from the shadows, Richard's anger boiled over. He clenched the steering wheel, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He wanted to storm up to her porch, to confront her, to make her see the pain she had caused. But he held back. Not yet. He needed to be smart about this. He needed to make sure she felt every ounce of his rage. Harmony Creek was the kind of town that postcards were made of. Nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, it was a place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. The streets were lined with quaint shops and cozy homes, their front porches adorned with flower boxes and rocking chairs. Children played in the park, their laughter echoing through the town square, while elderly couples strolled hand in hand, greeting neighbors with warm smiles. At the heart of Harmony Creek was the community center, a bustling hub of activity where residents gathered for everything from yoga classes to town hall meetings. It was here that Richard Holt had made a name for himself. Richard was a pillar of the community, a man admired for his charisma and dedication. As the director of the community center, he organized events, led volunteer efforts, and mentored local youth. He was the kind of person who always had a kind word or a helping hand to offer. To the people of Harmony Creek, he was a role model, a man of faith and integrity. But behind the polished facade was a different man. Richard's public persona was carefully crafted, a mask he wore to hide the darker aspects of his nature. In private, he was controlling, manipulative, and prone to fits of rage. Few people saw this side of him, only those closest to him like Clara and Eleanor. Clara Vance had once been one of Richard's biggest supporters. They had met in college, drawn together by their shared faith and ambition. At first, their marriage had seemed like a fairy tale. Richard was charming and attentive, and Clara had felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But over time, the cracks began to show. Richard's controlling nature emerged, his temper flaring over the smallest things. He criticized Clara's decisions, isolated her from friends and family, and demanded unwavering obedience. Eleanor, Clara's mother, had been the first to notice the change. She had always been close to her daughter, and it didn't take long for her to see the toll Richard's behavior was taking. She encouraged Clara to stand up for herself, to seek help, but Clara had been reluctant. She loved Richard, and she believed he could change. It wasn't until the night Richard shoved her during an argument that Clara finally decided to leave. The divorce had been messy, a bitter battle that dragged on for months. Clara fought for custody of their 2 children, Emily and Jacob, while Richard fought to maintain control. Eleanor had been Clara's rock throughout the ordeal. She had helped her daughter navigate the legal system, provided emotional support, and even testified against Richard in court. Her testimony had been damning, detailing the abuse she had witnessed and the fear Clara had lived with. The court's decision to grant Clara full custody had been a turning point. For Clara, it was a victory, a chance to start over. For Richard, it was a humiliation, a blow to his pride and his carefully constructed image. In the weeks that followed, Richard's public demeanor remained unchanged. He continued to lead the community center, his smile as warm as ever. But in private, his anger festered, his resentment growing with each passing day. He blamed Eleanor for his loss. In his mind, she was the one who had turned Clara against him, the one who had ruined his life. And he was determined to make her pay. Absolutely. Let's continue with Section 2. The facade and the stalking, and move to Part B. The crumbling marriage. I'll break it into parts to meet the specified word count and ensure it's detailed and engaging. I'll wait for your approval before proceeding to the next part. The cracks in Richard and Clara's marriage had started small, almost imperceptible. At first, it was little things, a sharp comment here, a dismissive gesture there. Clara had brushed them off, attributing them to stress or fatigue. Richard was a busy man, after all, juggling his responsibilities at the community center and his role as a pastor. She told herself it was just a phase, that things would get better. But they didn't. Over time, Richard's behavior grew more controlling. He began to dictate what Clara wore, who she could see, and even how she spent her days. He criticized her parenting, accusing her of being too lenient with Emily and Jacob. He isolated her from her friends and family, convincing her that they didn't understand their special bond. Clara had tried to push back, to assert her independence, but every attempt was met with anger or manipulation. Richard would alternate between explosive outbursts and tearful apologies, leaving Clara confused and exhausted. Eleanor had been the first to notice the change. She had always been close to her daughter, and it didn't take long for her to see the toll Richard's behavior was taking. "Clara," she had said one evening, her voice gentle but firm, "this isn't healthy. You can't let him control you like this." Clara had hesitated, torn between her love for Richard and the growing unease in her gut. "He's just under a lot of pressure," she had replied. "He'll calm down once things settle." But Eleanor hadn't been convinced. "Pressure doesn't excuse his behavior. You deserve better, Clara. The children deserve better." The breaking point came on a cold winter night. Clara had been preparing dinner when Richard stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed with anger. "Where's my blue shirt?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Clara had looked up, startled. "I washed it. It's in the closet." "I told you not to touch it," Richard snapped. "You never listened to me." Clara had tried to stay calm, to defuse the situation. "Richard, it's just a shirt. I didn't think." But before she could finish, Richard had grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "You didn't think? That's the problem, Clara. You never think." For a moment, Clara had frozen, too shocked to react. Then, with a strength she didn't know she had, she pulled away. "Don't touch me," she had said, her voice trembling but firm. Richard had stared at her, his eyes blazing with anger. But instead of apologizing, he had turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. That night, Clara had packed a bag for herself and the children. She had called Eleanor, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. "Mom," she had said, her voice breaking, "I need your help." The night was still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Eleanor Vance sat on her porch, a book in her hands, the soft glow of the porch light casting a warm halo around her. She had just finished her evening tea and was enjoying the cool night air, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. Richard Holt watched her from the darkness, his eyes fixed on her every movement. He had been planning this moment for weeks, his obsession with her growing with each passing day. Tonight, he would make her pay for what she had done. As Eleanor stood to go inside, Richard moved. He was quick and silent, slipping through the back door he had forced open earlier. The house was dark, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. Eleanor froze as she stepped into the kitchen, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. Before she could react, Richard was behind her, his hand clamping over her mouth. "Don't scream," he whispered, his voice low and menacing. "You don't want to do that." Eleanor's heart raced, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She tried to pull away, but Richard's grip was ironclad. "You thought you could ruin me," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "You thought you could take everything from me and walk away. But tonight, you're going to learn what happens when you cross me." Richard dragged Eleanor into the living room, his movements frantic and deliberate. She fought against him, her nails clawing at his arms, but he was too strong. He shoved her to the floor, his eyes blazing with a mix of rage and something darker, something unhinged. "You took my children," he snarled, his voice trembling with fury. "You turned Clara against me. You ruined my life. And now you're going to pay." Eleanor's mind raced, searching for a way to escape, to reason with him, to do anything to stop what was about to happen. But Richard wasn't listening. His mind was consumed by hatred, his actions driven by a need to destroy her. He pulled a roll of duct tape from his pocket and tore off a strip, pressing it over Eleanor's mouth to silence her. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled, her cries swallowed by the tape. Richard's hands moved quickly, binding her wrists with another strip of tape. Eleanor thrashed, her eyes wide with terror, but it was no use. Richard was too strong, his movements too precise. Then he pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the dim light, its edge sharp and menacing. Eleanor's eyes locked onto it, her breath coming in panicked gasps through her nose. She tried to scream, but the tape over her mouth stifled the sound. Richard leaned over her, his face inches from hers. "You thought you could win," he said, his voice eerily calm. "But you lost. You lost everything." Without warning, he plunged the knife into her side. Eleanor's body jerked, a muffled cry escaping her lips. Richard stabbed her again and again, his movements frenzied, his face twisted with rage. When he finally stopped, Eleanor lay still, her body trembling, her breath shallow. Richard stood over her, his chest heaving, his hands slick with blood. "This is what you deserve," he said, his voice cold and empty. The morning sun rose over Harmony Creek, casting a golden glow over the town. But the peacefulness of the scene was shattered by the discovery of Eleanor Vance's body in her backyard. The news spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the tight-knit community. Richard Holt, the respected pastor and community leader, was nowhere to be found. As investigators pieced together the evidence, the truth began to emerge. A story of obsession, rage, and a facade that had hidden a monster. But this story isn't just about Richard or Eleanor. It's about the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface, the hidden threats that can exist in even the most peaceful communities. It's a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones capable of the greatest harm. Have you ever known someone who presented a false image? What were they hiding, and how did it affect those around them? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story could help others recognize the signs of hidden danger. The discovery of Eleanor's body sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek. The police cordoned off the area, treating it as a crime scene. Detective Marcus Hale, who had been assigned to the case, arrived shortly after the initial responders. Hale took in the scene with a practiced eye, his expression grim. The brutality of the crime was evident. Eleanor's body showed signs of a violent struggle, and the forensic team quickly identified multiple stab wounds. The duct tape over her mouth and the bindings on her wrists pointed to a deliberate, calculated attack. As the investigation unfolded, Hale and his team began to piece together the timeline of events. Neighbors were interviewed, security footage from nearby homes was reviewed, and phone records were pulled. One name kept coming up: Richard Holt. Clara, still reeling from the loss of her mother, provided crucial information about Richard's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. She recounted the custody battle, his growing resentment toward Eleanor, and his threats. He blamed her for everything, Clara said, her voice trembling. He said she ruined his life. The forensic evidence was damning. Blood samples taken from the scene matched Richard's DNA, and footprints found in the garden matched his shoe size. Security footage from a neighbor's camera showed a figure matching Richard's description entering Eleanor's backyard late that night. Phone records revealed that Richard had been in the area at the time of the murder, and his car had been spotted near Eleanor's house on multiple occasions in the days leading up to the crime. When confronted with the evidence, Richard denied any involvement, but his alibi was shaky at best. He claimed he had been home alone that night, but there was no one to corroborate his story. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Richard was the prime suspect. The police obtained a warrant for his arrest, and within days he was taken into custody. Absolutely. Let's continue with Section 3, the investigation and trial, and move to Part B, Richard's arrest and trial. I'll break it into parts to meet the specified word count and ensure it's detailed and engaging. I'll wait for your approval before proceeding to the next part. Richard Holt's arrest sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek. The news spread quickly, leaving the community in disbelief. How could a man so respected, so admired, be capable of such a heinous crime? Richard was taken into custody without incident, his calm demeanor unnerving the officers who escorted him to the police station. He maintained his innocence, his voice steady as he repeated his alibi. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and it wasn't long before he was formally charged with Eleanor Vance's murder. The trial began several months later, the courtroom packed with spectators eager to see justice served. Clara sat in the front row, her children by her side, her face a mask of grief and determination. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case. They called witnesses, including Clara, who recounted Richard's threats and his growing obsession with Eleanor. They presented the forensic evidence, the DNA, the footprints, the security footage, and painted a picture of a man consumed by rage and hatred. The defense, led by a sharp and experienced attorney named Gregory Hayes, did their best to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof Richard had committed the crime. But their efforts were undermined by Richard's own behavior. On the stand, he was cold and unrepentant, his answers evasive and at times contradictory. When questioned about his relationship with Eleanor, his anger flared, his mask of calm slipping for all to see. The prosecution seized on this, using Richard's outbursts to reinforce their argument that he was capable of violence. They called expert witnesses to testify about the nature of the crime, the level of planning involved, and the brutality of the attack. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll on Clara and her children became increasingly evident. They sat through hours of testimony, reliving the horror of Eleanor's murder, their grief palpable. The defense's final attempt to sway the jury came in the form of a character witness, a member of Richard's congregation who spoke of his kindness and dedication. But even this was met with skepticism, the prosecution quick to point out that Richard's public persona was just that, a persona. When the prosecution delivered their closing arguments, they left no room for doubt. They painted Richard as a manipulative, controlling man who had lashed out in a fit of rage, taking the life of an innocent woman who had dared to stand up to him. The defense's closing arguments were less convincing, their attempts to cast doubt on the evidence falling flat in the face of the prosecution's compelling case. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Clara sat with her children, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door where the jury would soon return. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Clara sat with her children, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door where the jury would soon return. When the door finally opened, the room seemed to hold its breath. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable, and took their seats. The judge called for order, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The foreman stood, a piece of paper in his hand. "We have, Your Honor." Clara's heart raced as the verdict was read aloud. "We, the jury, Find the defendant, Richard Holt, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Clara let out a sob, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Her children clung to her, their own tears mingling with hers. Richard sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Richard shrugged it off, his eyes burning with anger. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The town of Harmony Creek was forever changed by the events surrounding Eleanor Vance's murder. What was once a peaceful, close-knit community now felt fractured, its residents struggling to reconcile the image of Richard Holt they had known with the monster he had become. The news of Richard's conviction spread quickly, leaving the town in a state of shock. Many refused to believe it at first, clinging to the memory of the man who had led their community center, organized charity events, and preached kindness and forgiveness. But as the details of the trial emerged, the truth became impossible to ignore. The community center, once a bustling hub of activity, now stood eerily quiet. The programs Richard had championed were suspended, the building's doors locked. The town council struggled to find a replacement, but no one wanted to step into the role Richard had once filled. Clara and her children became the focus of the town's sympathy and support. Neighbors brought meals, offered to babysit, and organized fundraisers to help them rebuild their lives. But despite the outpouring of kindness, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. Clara and her children moved out of Harmony Creek, seeking a fresh start in a new town. The memories of Eleanor's murder and the trial were too painful, the reminders of Richard's betrayal too constant. But even in their new home, the scars remained. Clara struggled with anxiety and depression, her nights plagued by nightmares. Her children, too young to fully understand what had happened, carried their own burdens, their innocence forever tainted by the tragedy. Despite the challenges, Clara was determined to rebuild their lives. She found a job, enrolled her children in a new school, and began the slow process of healing. But the loss of her mother and the betrayal of the man she had once loved would always be a part of her story. The story of Richard Holt and Eleanor Vance is a stark reminder of the destructive power of rage and obsession. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring the signs of abuse and manipulation, and the devastating impact they can have on families and communities. Richard's public persona as a respected community leader hid a darker truth, a man capable of unspeakable violence. His actions not only took the life of an innocent woman but also shattered the trust of an entire town. The empty community center stands as a symbol of that betrayal, a reminder of the damage one person can inflict. But it also serves as a call to action, a plea for vigilance and awareness. Domestic abuse and manipulation often go unnoticed until it's too late. But by recognizing the signs and speaking up, we can help prevent tragedies like this from happening again. What lessons can we learn from this tragic story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights could help others recognize the signs of abuse and manipulation. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Together, we can raise awareness and help create safer communities for everyone. Thank you for watching The Sinister Crime Stories. Stay tuned for more gripping tales that explore the darker side of human nature.